All right. Just to give just to give the presence of the manifesto in its entirety, it begins with an introduction, and what it talks about is how communism has proved its power in Europe, that it is a power among other powers, and that it should state its principles and aims. Now, this is in contrast to the sort of clandestine, illegal, hidden activity of the League of the Just, but this is basically the introduction which kicks it off. And it's really interesting. The first introduction is the bourgeois and the proletarians, which go to lay out the two classes Marx sees as more and more being the contending forces in his particular era. So he says all history is a history of class struggle, and he lays out numerous different sorts of class struggles historically, and he also says there's no destiny. It doesn't mean the lower class is always going to win, but it can end in a mutual ruination of them both, as he says. So it's important that even though this is the Communist Manifesto, which is very much a very pro-communist, up with the people, we're going to win this thing document, there is that realization that communism may not win and will end in the mutual ruination of all the contending classes. So with that incredibly bright introduction, or rather with the history of all history being a history of class struggle, he goes into the history of the bourgeois class. And it's important that he's writing this in 47, 48, the end of 47, beginning of 48. So he can actually say something like the history of the bourgeois class is a revolutionary history. And he lays this out in a number of ways. First off, the bourgeois have significantly lessened class relationships. Where before there were multiple different classes. In ancient Rome, for example, you had patricians, landowners, the soldiers that didn't own slaves but were just working their own land, landless merchants, etc., etc. What he noticed is the bourgeois have put an end to this. He also noticed the bourgeois were oppressed, more or less, under feudalism because they did not fall into the lineage which the upper class had, that is to say, the aristocracy. But he also noticed that the bourgeois used colonialism and the European drive to worldwide empire for its own growth. And particularly, this is not in this particular thing. You should be conscious of, for example, how did the Spanish treat the Americas? And how did the British treat the Americas? How did France treat the Americas? How did the Portuguese treat Spain and India and the Chinese? You know, so there is this really deep historical drive towards an empire or even multiple empires that involve carving up parts of the world. And in addition to this, the bourgeois revolutionized the means of production beyond simple manufacture and into industry and new technology. And that's really important. Manufacture is one thing, and there was plenty of manufacture in the Middle Ages, but industry as such, which is the fusion of merchant capital and manufacturing capital into industrial capital, is a new phenomenon. Marx doesn't talk about it here, but we may see that a little later when we enter wage labor and capital. The bourgeois destroy all previous relations for the sake of the relationship of profit. Former modes of production are abolished for the sake of new modes of production. National art is abolished in the state of world art. And to a certain extent, he's being kind of hyperbolic here, I think, but you can take it how you will. Consumer products draw all the people of the earth in and serve as weapons to open new markets of capitalism. Here he famously refers to the barbarian markets, the markets of the Chinese, and that these markets are smashed open by the cannons of capitalism. And it's interesting to note, just he also says civilizations either are given the, arguably given the choice of choose capitalism or die, or face destruction, is what he actually says. But the thing is, capitalism generates its own destruction. One of the most important things that we'll see again and again and again, and we'll very clearly see it later in the manifesto, and we'll also very clearly see it when we get to wage, labor, and capital. Capitalist overproduction forces itself into crisis. And also, capitalism creates the proletariat. It creates the class of workers that work the means of production, which we'll get to and we'll talk about, but works in the factories or whatever in order to generate products that the capitalists can sell for capital. And what does Marx say about the proletariat? They live as long as they find work. They sell themselves hour by hour. Admittedly, this is not verbatim. You may get a salary. You may be paid daily. It's not absolutely vital. It's hour by hour. But what is important is they become part of the machines they work on as their work becomes degraded. And what I mean by that, what I believe Marx means by that, is during the Middle Ages and the early to mid Renaissance, craftspeople were a guild, and a guild took on various apprentices, and once the apprentice learned the trade, they became a journeyman. That implies a level of skill. What Marx is saying is that the level of machines and industrialization reduces the need for that skill, reduces the need for knowledge on how to work a material, how to do X, Y, or Z, and instead the work becomes degraded, not necessarily as a moral term, but just as a fact that it doesn't need skilled people anymore to work it. Also, capitalism generates equality between men and women through the use of machines, which is to say they're exploited equally. And in fact, this was actually more the case, it still is the case, that women were exploited. But what a lot of people found, a lot of capitalists found, is that women who were forced into the workplace in order to make up wages for survival for their family, could do generally the same jobs that men could with industry involved, with these new machines. And there was no prejudice inherent in these machines. There was no bias for women or against women necessarily. I mean, there was some, but just as a general sweeping notion, women and children could just as easily work the machines, work in the mines, work, all of these heavy industries as men could, and they did. So it generated an equality, but of course the equality was an equality of degradation. Marx doesn't say any of that. He just talks about the equality. They're also exploited on the consumer side because capitalism destroys small producers who can no longer compete with large capital. We often hear about the poor Midwest farmer. And there are a few poor Midwest farmers. But the fact of the matter is, almost, I think it's, I don't know. The last time I checked, it was 89%. But that was like 10 years ago. Something like 90% of all of our agricultural products are made and in factory farms. And I'm not just talking brutalization of animals, like just tomatoes, lettuce, you name it. So here's the thing, that's just in the farms, but also materials being made, handicrafts, medical supplies, you name it. Generally, capitalism creates it better. I don't know if better is necessarily the case, but it definitely creates it faster and cheaper and in more quantities than any individual craftsperson can create it. And especially in 1848, in which the craftspeople were just utterly devastated by the rise of industrial capital. But the proletariat, which is industrial workers, arguably, advances their struggle against the bourgeoisie. Actually, let me not say arguably. Proletariat is industrial workers. What exactly is meant by that remains to be seen. So, but they, in 1848, and going back to Marx, the proletariat advanced their struggle against the bourgeoisie. In the first phase, initially the proletariat smashed the machines that they view as destroying their way of life. And in fact, if you've ever heard of a saboteur, that actually comes from, I believe, a French or Dutch word. I think it might be Flemish, which is, in any case, which actually means shoe, where workers would throw their shoes, which were wooden, into the means of production, the machines that would factor, and they would smash up the machines as a way to secure their way of life. That didn't work at all. So instead they began to politically organize at the behest of the bourgeoisie to fight the bourgeoisie's enemies, which is to say the aristocrats, the monarchs, the people instituting huge amounts of taxes, not allowing bread to go to the cities, etc., etc. But the second phase, industry began to obliterate the difference between the working class, and they began to form unions to maintain their own survival. So very quickly, in fact, the question became, all right, yeah, you're a small business owner, or you work for yourself, self-employed, but I'm employed by this guy. What's happening? We're losing, and so you get very quickly unions attempting to be formed. They are pretty much still illegal across the board. I think there were a couple unions that were allowed, but at least for the United States, they weren't allowed until much, much later. And in fact, the anti-monopoly laws were frequently used against unions. And slowly these unions gained victories, but they're often crushed. All you have to do is look at the unfortunately named Knights of Labor, and they formed a union, they were crushed. But what's important is that there's not any particular given direct success. What's important is every success that further organizes the working class. And this is Marx saying that, not me. The third phase, the proletariat began to form as a class and fight for universal class interests. So what this means is suddenly it's not like, oh, well, I'm just a temporary out of work shop owner, or I'm a temporary out-of-work carpenter, people begin to get, no, I'm just a worker, and they'll use me when they need me. They'll throw me away when they don't, and so now I need to fight for the interests of the working class as a whole, rather than individually. And they begin to form political parties and make universal political demands. So this is left generally vague because honestly they weren't allowed to form particularly strong political parties or make particular political demands really with much emphasis at this time. Keep in mind, it takes 40 years for them to politically demand firmly an 8-hour workday, which was flowing more or less off and on for 40 years at the time of the writing. And it actually took the Haymarket rioters, who were primarily anarchists, to actually make that a universal demand that workers in all countries fought for. So classes, he also talks about the classes under struggle, and they bring education and enlightenment to the working class as the older classes. Now, keep in mind, the bourgeoisie, that is to say the capitalists, have got a pretty firm grip on things. So the aristocrats, the clergy, etc., they end up losing much of their power, and a large chunk of them begin to break off and form with the bourgeoisie, or form with the proletariat. And so that's one part. The other thing is some of the bourgeoisie begin to join the revolutionary proletariat because they don't like these tensions. And you can see this throughout history. It's very rare, but its examples are very clear and very obvious, that many times the rich, rather than joining the proletariat as like, oh, Bill Gates, oh, good, we'll help you so you can buy our product later. Just to give a clear example, just one clear example, Frederick Engels was the co-writer of much of Marx's communist works, was a factory owner, and he was like, yeah, this is not going to work out well for us in general, so I'm throwing my lot in with the working class. And let's be fair, and this is not in the manifesto, let's see how much Engels really did throw his lot in with the working class, but he tried, so, whatever. The petty bourgeois, which is the small business owners, are conservative or reactionary in an attempt to save themselves, and those which are revolutionary are only so in light of their descent into the proletariat. Now, this is really important for you to think about, and again, this is not in Marx. Imagine the fight for 15. How many times that you've said it and your racist uncle says, well, we can't have a $15 minimum wage. What'll happen to all those poor small business owners? That's the reactionary version of the petty bourgeois, right? The small business owner who's such a good guy, but they're not a good guy. Honestly, they're raping and exploiting as much as possible to save their petty existence. Now, on the other hand, there are other small business owners, and I know this for a literal fact, that I know a small business owner who got called, who's like, hey, we're calling your business because we want a donation to help us fight against the fight for 15 in the legislature. And small business is a relative term. It's a fairly large business. And that business owner was like, why would I pay you? I view it as the guillotine tax. I want to pay to people good wages so I don't have this problem that Marx talks about. That's one aspect of like a progressive petty bourgeois. Another part of the progressive petty bourgeois is, wow, my business is dying, and I'm gonna have to work for somebody like pretty soon. Like maybe not in the next couple months, but in the next couple years. I want to be treated really well when that comes up. So that's the progressive petty bourgeois. The next is lumpen, which could join the revolutionary struggles. And there's a lot of confusion among what the lumpen is. The lumpen proletariat and the lumpen bourgeois. Lumpen means rags. This is pure criminality. Like, I'm not talking about some dude who sells weed, but then also works at like McDonald's or UPS or something. It's not. It's pure criminality. Generally, people who depend on pure criminality, and that this, I'm not talking about the bourgeois or the proletariat who fall on hard times. When we're talking pure criminality, then generally they are not friends of the proletariat, and Marx says, in fact, are most likely to function as a tool of the bourgeoisie, which I'm going to 100% agree with. So, why are we so keen on the proletariat? The proletariat are without property. Their family relations are not the same as bourgeois relations. Especially in 1848, they're constantly exploiting their relationship. Wife, husband, children all go to the factory. Also, talking about class, previous minorities fought for their own means of existence and appropriation. Just to say, the bourgeoisie were once a small minority. They sought to get appropriation through buying and selling and gaining profit off of that. At the time, landlords' primary mode of appropriation was off a feudal tax. They would tax the land, tax the bread, and they would just get a certain tax. And so this was their own means of reproduction. However, because the proletariat have no mode of appropriation, they fight for the abolition of the system of appropriation. So this lays out basically the essential core of Marx, that the proletariat seeks to abolish itself and abolish the very conditions which give rise to itself. So what is the nature of this struggle? The proletariat are a vast majority, and for them to change their conditions, they will have to overthrow the existing society. And what do we call this? It's simply called a revolution. It was called a revolution when the bourgeois overthrew the feudal lords. It was called a revolution when feudal lords overthrew each other. It's a revolution. The form of struggle consists of the proletariat fighting against its own national bourgeoisie. This is very important. And it's right here. And I make very clear pains that I say things, I use examples. This is right here in Marx. The proletariat fight against their own national bourgeoisie. Isn't it so funny that you can say, oh, the bourgeoisie of the French or the Germans or the Russians or the British are bad, or even more topically, the Syrians are bad. Yes, they are certainly bad. Hands down. If you're an actual communist, there's not really a lot to justify that. It's not a lot to justify the way that they act. But our task, as is the task of every proletarian revolution, to fight against his own national bourgeoisie first and foremost. And so, and with that, the expansion of capitalism continues to degrade the worker so that he cannot even continue his slavish existence. All you have to do is look at the COVID pandemic, see where we are today. And there we are in the end. The necessity of social labor creates greater association among workers, which help bring about the destruction of capitalism. Now, this is very important. We don't all work by ourselves at home, theoretically, like they did in the 1820s. We don't sew clothes at home. We don't spin fabric at home. We generally go to a job, and that job has us interacting with other people. We should be aware of that and use that to our greatest advantage possible. So this ends the introduction and first section. Coming up soon is Proletarians and Communists.